There was a silence that even Rick could not tinker with. It wasn't the absence of noise, not exactly, but a soft, enveloping quiet that seemed to hum in the bones of the Citadel itself. It was the kind of silence that made the edges of the universe feel warmer and the shadows strangely kind. Even in this vast, chaotic multiverse, it whispered gently that someone truly cared, someone who understood the weight of wandering. And I want you to know right now that we truly love and care for you. You've taken a moment from your day, from your world, to be here. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, let's get started. Rick sat on the edge of a metallic ledge, high above the sprawling corridors of the Citadel, his legs dangling over voids that hummed faintly like distant strings. He wasn't searching for adventure today, nor for problems to fix, though, as always, trouble seemed to have a strange gravitational pull. No, today he simply listened. And in that listening, he felt the faintest tremor of something forgotten. Morty was somewhere below, probably attempting to fix something that wasn't broken, or perhaps just hiding from the usual chaos. Rick could almost hear the soft thrum of Morty's heartbeat through the walls, a reminder that even the smallest lives carried weight beyond comprehension. He remembered the first time he had noticed it. A pulse, a rhythm, a small, fragile tether to the world that insisted softly on being remembered. The silence had begun early before the Citadel awoke in earnest. Stars outside the transparent walls flickered lazily as if taking their own sleepy breaths, and somewhere, in the distance, a ship hummed its steady tune, like a lullaby sung by someone who had lived 1,000 lives and learned, at last, to rest. Rick let himself feel it, carefully. A rare moment, not fear, not irritation, not curiosity, but something quieter, something like awe. He thought of the memories tucked in the corners of his mind, summer nights on Earth, Morty falling asleep in the back seat of a ship, while Rick hummed tunes from a world that no longer existed. He remembered the way Morty's small hand had pressed against his, asking silently for reassurance, for safety, for something bigger than both of them. And for the first time in a long while, Rick didn't try to fix anything, he just let the silence carry him. It was strange, Rick decided, how the universe could feel both enormous and intimate all at once. One moment he was alone in a corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely, the next he could feel Morty's presence like a soft pulse beside him. He thought of all the Ricks and Mortys out there, scattered across infinite realities, each carrying their own quiet burdens. And in that thought, he found a gentle comfort. Maybe, just maybe, someone was listening somewhere, even to him. The silence was no longer empty. It was a bridge, a soft current between hearts, and Rick leaned back, letting the hum of the multiverse lull him like a slow, careful breath. He thought, not for the first time, that perhaps the universe had its own way of reminding him that even the quietest souls left ripples, small and enduring, in ways that could never be measured or fixed. And so, Rick stayed. He watched the stars. He listened to the hum. And somewhere, in the slow, stretching quiet, he allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement. He was not quite alone. The silence had come to stay for a little while, and for once, that was enough. Morty's whisper was almost lost in the quiet hum of the Citadel, but Rick heard it anyway. He had learned, over years and infinities, to notice the small things, the twitch of a finger, the soft sigh of someone unsure of themselves, the way a voice faltered just enough to carry unspoken weight. Morty's words were few, but they were steady, like tiny lanterns glowing in a corridor of darkness. "You ever feel like it's all just too much?" Morty said. His voice was careful, hesitant, but there was a softness that cut through Rick's usual haze of cynicism. Rick didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He had learned that sometimes listening was more important than fixing, that quiet acknowledgement was its own kind of gravity. Outside, the stars pulsed faintly, as if in rhythm with the little tremors of their hearts. The Citadel stretched and yawned around them, corridors looping like gentle rivers, carrying fragments of forgotten conversations and distant laughter. Somewhere far away, another Rick probably tinkered with something that didn't matter. Another Morty probably trembled at the edges of fear and hope. And yet here, in this small bubble of shared presence, the two of them existed entirely for themselves. Rick thought of all the times he had overlooked Morty's whispers. How many lessons had slipped past him because he was too busy shouting, too busy proving something to the universe that no one else cared about? He remembered the tiny moments of courage, the quiet decisions Morty had made, and realized that the boy had always been stronger than he gave him credit for. Strength, he now understood, was not always loud. Sometimes it was a soft whisper that insisted you keep moving, keep breathing, keep hoping, even when everything seemed absurdly, impossibly heavy. Morty fiddled with a small device, his hands shaking slightly, and Rick watched without comment. The boy was learning, in his own messy, tentative way, to navigate the endless chaos of realities. And somehow it felt like watching a flower open in slow motion, impossible to rush, impossible to ignore, beautiful in its own fragile certainty. You hear it too, right?" Morty's voice was barely above a breath. "The silence." Rick nodded, though he didn't need to. "Yeah," he said softly, letting the word hang in the air. No explanation, no analysis, just the acknowledgement that they were both there, both listening, both part of something bigger than themselves. It wasn't magic, it wasn't science, it was simply being. Being together, even in the quietest of moments, had its own kind of gravity. Morty leaned back slightly, eyes tracing the dim glow of distant stars through the Citadel's transparent walls. Rick could see the soft worry, the hesitant hope, the small pulse of wonder that always lingered behind Morty's gaze. And in that gaze, Rick felt a curious, unfamiliar warmth, not pride, not joy exactly, but a quiet, steady acknowledgement. This boy, this version of Morty, had already survived so much, and yet still carried a tender kind of hope that could light the darkness. The silence stretched longer, but it was no longer empty. It had shape, texture, a gentle pulse that connected them. Rick found himself humming softly, a tune that had no beginning and no end, a melody that seemed to belong as much to Morty as it did to him. Morty's whisper joined it, faintly, uncertainly, and together their presence made the vast Citadel feel a little smaller, a little more intimate, a little more like home. And in that moment Rick realized something he hadn't admitted before. He didn't need to fix everything. He didn't need to conquer or escape or outsmart the universe. Sometimes he just needed to hear a whisper, to feel a presence, to let the silence itself carry the lessons he had long ignored. Somewhere, far beyond the edges of their current reality, the multiverse breathed quietly, as if acknowledging their small, fragile connection. And Rick leaned back again, letting the soft hum of existence fill him. Morty was there. The silence was there, and for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. The Citadel at dusk looked nothing like the chaos everyone assumed it to be. In that hour, when the corridors softened under the amber glow of artificial lights, it seemed almost tender, an entire city of infinite lives pausing for a moment to breathe. Rick leaned against a railing, the hum of distant engines mixing with the faint echoes of footsteps far below. He realized quietly that he had never truly noticed this side of the Citadel. Not really. Morty was nearby, fiddling with a small holographic map, tracing pathways that twisted and curled like rivers of light. The boy's brow furrowed in concentration, but there was also something softer there. Curiosity that wasn't anxious, attention that wasn't desperate, wonder that didn't need explanation. Rick found himself watching Morty, not to correct or guide, but simply to observe. And in that observation, he felt the slow bloom of something he rarely allowed himself: patience. A distant starship hummed along a quiet trajectory, its light reflecting across the Citadel's glassy walls. Rick thought about how many versions of himself had seen this same moment in countless realities, how many Mortys had leaned over similar maps, their small fingers tracing impossible paths. And yet, this moment was unique. This moment belonged to them. It belonged to the gentle quiet that had settled between them, a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like understanding. You ever wonder if they notice? Morty's voice was soft, almost hesitant. All the little things, the quiet parts. Rick considered it, eyes following the fading sunlight across the metallic corridors. He thought of the Ricks who screamed to be heard, the Mortys who trembled under pressure, the endless cycles of chaos and noise. Maybe not, he said finally. But maybe they don't have to. Some things just are. Morty's lips pressed into a line, and for a moment the boy looked uncertain. Then with a soft exhale, he leaned back, letting the hum of the Citadel seep into his bones. Rick noticed how small moments like this, tiny pauses, careful observations, whispered thoughts, were the threads that wove the vastness of the universe into something bearable, something warm. As the shadows stretched longer across the hallways, Rick let himself remember a time long ago, a day on Earth when the sky bled gold and pink, and he had held Morty in his arms while the boy dozed against him. He remembered the gentle weight of trust, the quiet, unspoken bond between them, and he realized that every small choice he had made since then had been an attempt to honor that trust, even when he didn't know how. Somewhere in the far reaches of the Citadel, a faint laugh echoed, soft and accidental, carrying through empty halls. Rick imagined it might belong to a version of himself he didn't recognize, or perhaps to a Morty who had finally learned to ask for help without fear. He let the sound fill the silence around him, feeling a gentle warmth ripple through the spaces between the walls. The day softened into night. Lights flickered on in distant apartments, corridors glimmered with subdued reflections, and the Citadel seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging the quiet presence of its smallest, most unusual inhabitants. Rick leaned further against the railing, and for the first time in an indeterminate while, he allowed himself to stop planning, stop calculating, stop fighting the current. He listened. Morty listened. And somewhere in that soft, amber-lit dusk, the Citadel itself seemed to listen too, holding them in a quiet embrace that required no words, no explanations, no heroics, just presence. And Rick, finally, let himself feel it, the gentle peace that existed in small things, in small moments, in the slow, careful attention given to someone who needed to be seen, quietly, gently, without expectation. The city hummed softly. The stars waited patiently. And Rick, for the first time, felt that maybe, just maybe, being present could be enough. Rick wandered down a corridor he had walked 100 times before, though tonight it felt unfamiliar. The lights flickered with a gentle, lazy rhythm, casting soft shadows that stretched like sighs across the walls. Somewhere in the hum of the Citadel, he imagined the faint echo of a portal he had once used, one that had carried him to a world of endless orange skies where the stars burned slow and heavy, like the weight of memory itself. He remembered it only in fragments, a sensation more than a vision, like the ghost of a dream brushing against the back of his mind. Morty followed behind, quieter than usual, his steps tentative but certain. Rick could hear the faint clink of the boy's shoes against the metal floor, and it reminded him that even the smallest gestures, the briefest touches of presence, could hold worlds of meaning. Morty had always moved through the universe differently than Rick. Where Rick saw solutions and problems, chaos and control, Morty saw moments, threads of possibility that bent gently toward hope. "Rick, do you think portals forget us?" Morty asked, voice soft, almost lost in the ambient hum. Rick chuckled, a low sound that vibrated through the quiet. "I don't know, Morty. Maybe they do, or maybe they just remember differently. Sometimes things keep a memory even when we've moved on. Sometimes the universe remembers better than we do." They paused before a dormant portal. A ring of light dimmed to the faintest shimmer. Rick ran a finger along its edge, feeling the subtle vibration that lingered even when the machinery was off. It was like touching the spine of a forgotten book, pages curled and worn but still holding stories. He remembered worlds that no longer existed, choices that had never been made, and paths that had been abandoned before they were ever walked. Morty peered into the darkened circle, eyes wide but soft. "Do you think we could go back?" Rick hesitated, not because he doubted their ability, he could have powered the portal in an instant, but because some things weren't meant to be revisited. Some journeys, no matter how tempting, were meant to live quietly in memory, not in reality. Yet there was comfort in standing here together, acknowledging what had been, even if it could never be again. "Maybe," Rick said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not in the way you're thinking, but we can remember. We can let it remind us of what we've learned, of what we've carried." Morty nodded slowly, as if absorbing more than the words themselves. The silence of the corridor wrapped around them, a gentle embrace, holding them still without demanding action. Rick noticed how Morty's breathing had softened, how the small rise and fall of his chest carried a rhythm that seemed to echo the faint heartbeat of the Citadel itself. They moved on, leaving the dormant portal behind. But the portal did not vanish from memory. It lingered in the soft spaces between thoughts, a gentle reminder that even forgotten doors could shape the paths we walk. Rick thought of all the portals he had left behind, worlds, decisions, relationships, and realized they were less like lost opportunities and more like quiet teachers. Each one whispered a lesson if only you paused long enough to hear it. Morty glanced back once, a faint smile tugging at his lips, before letting the corridor carry him forward. Rick followed, thinking about the strange comfort of forgotten places, of memories that remained in the hushed corners of existence. It was not the adventure that mattered, he understood now. It was the noticing, the quiet acknowledgement of what had passed, and the gentle persistence of presence, even when the universe felt too vast to hold. The corridor ended, opening into a small observation deck. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly, calm and patient. Rick let the stillness seep into him, feeling the faint hum of every portal he had ever used, every doorway he had ever crossed, as a soft lullaby. Morty leaned against the glass, tracing the constellations with a finger, quiet and contemplative. Rick watched him, letting the silence speak, letting the memory of the forgotten portals remind him that sometimes the most important journeys were the ones we carried within ourselves. And in that quiet reflection, the Citadel itself seemed to sigh softly, a reminder that even in the endless expanse of the multiverse, there were places, quiet, tender, unclaimed, that held space for both memory and presence. Rick leaned back on a soft ridge of the observation deck, letting the faint hum of the Citadel seep into his thoughts. The stars outside twinkled in rhythms he could almost feel, as if the universe itself had a heartbeat, slow and patient, pulsing through every reality at once. It was in these moments, quiet, almost imperceptible, that Rick sensed the weight and wonder of the multiverse, not in its chaos, not in its impossible engineering, but in the way it simply existed. Morty sat cross-legged beside him, tracing imaginary lines between stars with his finger. "Do you think every universe is waiting for someone to notice it?" he asked softly. His voice carried a curious reverence, one that made Rick stop, mid-thought, and listen. "Maybe," Rick said after a long pause. "Maybe some of them only exist for a moment, and the only way they matter is if someone's here to see them. And maybe that's enough." The boy considered this quietly, letting the words float between them like drifting clouds. Rick had spent so many years trying to fix realities, to control them, to manipulate outcomes. But here, in the lull of infinite possibilities, he realized that witnessing was a kind of care, perhaps even the kind that mattered most. They watched a streak of light far beyond the Citadel, a spaceship slipping through a hidden fold of reality, and Rick imagined countless versions of themselves scattered across innumerable worlds, each facing choices, fears, small victories, and quiet losses. In these one, Morty had learned to bend time. In another, he had never left the first planet he had known. And yet, in this universe, they sat side by side, listening, noticing, sharing a silence that was both vast and intimate. "You ever feel tired of knowing everything, Rick?" Morty murmured, leaning against the rail. "Like, sometimes the weight of it all just sits on your shoulders?" Rick let out a faint chuckle, more like an exhale. "Yeah, I think everyone does in their own way, but sometimes," he said, gazing at the faint shimmer of distant worlds, "you don't have to carry it. Sometimes you just let it hum around you like a quiet song. And you notice that's enough." Morty smiled faintly, a small warmth brightening his features. It wasn't a smile that demanded acknowledgement. It was a smile that existed for itself, a tender acknowledgement of the moment, of being seen without being measured or judged. Rick noticed it, filed it away in the soft corners of memory, and for once felt the faintest pull of contentment, not pride, not triumph, just the quiet glow of being present. They spoke little after that, letting the lull of infinite realities guide them. Rick noticed the subtle changes in the light as night stretched over the Citadel, the way stars shimmered differently as if acknowledging their quiet companionship. Morty hummed a tune, soft and uncertain, and Rick joined him, not in harmony, not in perfection, but in the simple act of noticing, of sharing a moment that belonged entirely to them. Time slipped softly, unmarked by clocks or crises. Rick realized that this was what he had been missing. Not control, not adventure, not discovery, but this quiet attention, this gentle acknowledgement that the universe was full of small wonders, and they were enough to hold, enough to witness, enough to let linger like a lullaby that hummed on long after the song had ended. Somewhere, far beyond the Citadel, other Ricks and Mortys moved through their own realities, unaware of this small, tender bubble of peace. But here, in this corner of existence, it was enough that two of them noticed, that two of them were present, that two of them carried the soft weight of infinity gently, quietly, as if it were a fragile feather they did not dare drop. Rick exhaled, letting the quiet seep into him, letting Morty's small hum echo like a heartbeat in the dark. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply exist, in wonder, in quiet awe, in the gentle, infinite lull of realities stretching on forever. The corridors of the Citadel carried echoes of lives Rick had only glimpsed in passing. Shadows of Ricks who laughed too loudly, Mortys who stumbled over impossible equations, voices that had never belonged to them yet somehow felt familiar. Tonight these echoes seemed softer, slower, like memories settling into corners they had long ignored. Rick walked alongside Morty, listening, noticing, letting the sounds wash over him like a warm, slow tide. "You ever think about the Ricks we've met?" Morty asked, voice hesitant, almost a whisper. "All the ones who didn't stick around?" Rick considered this, eyes tracing the faint reflection of distant stars across polished walls. "Yeah," he said softly. "Sometimes I do. And I think they leave traces, even if we don't see them. Small things, a smile remembered, a hand held in passing, something that hums quietly, reminding you that you're not alone, even when it feels like it." Morty nodded, absorbing the words in silence. Rick watched him, noticing the gentle curve of his shoulders, the quiet patience in his eyes. Morty's strength was never loud, never demanding attention. It existed in soft moments like this, in listening, in remembering, in acknowledging the subtle threads that wove the universe together. And Rick realized, slowly, that perhaps this was the kind of heroism that mattered most, not the kind that fought or conquered, but the kind that endured quietly, tenderly, persistently. The two of them passed a common room where faint laughter floated in the air. Rick recognized it instantly, a group of alternate Ricks reminiscing about a world no longer touched by their hands. There was no urgency in their laughter, no chaos, only the soft comfort of shared memories and familiar mistakes. Rick allowed himself a faint smile, thinking of how small gestures could ripple through infinite lives, unnoticed, yet profoundly present. Somewhere deep in the Citadel, a Morty hummed a tune that was older than most realities, a simple melody that seemed to wrap around Rick like a soft blanket. He remembered the first time he had heard it, back on a world that smelled of burnt toast and rain, and how it had rooted him to something unexplainably tender, something beyond formulas or inventions. That tune had survived countless universes, countless adventures, and here it was again, weaving threads of continuity through the quiet hum of existence. Rick looked at Morty. The boy's gaze was distant yet anchored, following lines of light that twisted like rivers across the Citadel walls. "You know," Rick said softly, "I think sometimes the universe doesn't just happen. Sometimes it remembers. Sometimes it leaves little breadcrumbs, little echoes, so we know we weren't entirely alone." Morty's lips curved slightly, a small smile that was both acknowledgement and question. Rick let the silence settle, letting the warmth of that fleeting connection hum through him. He thought of old friends, the ones who had drifted, disappeared, or been left behind. He thought of the laughter, the mistakes, the small kindnesses that endured far longer than the grand gestures, and realized that even absent presences could leave tender imprints on the soul. They walked on, letting the soft echoes guide them, letting the quiet become a companion rather than a void. The Citadel breathed with them, corridors stretching like gentle arms, carrying memories of countless Ricks and Mortys who had once wandered here, and perhaps would again. Rick's shoulders loosened. Morty hummed a quiet note, barely audible, yet enough to anchor them both. In that gentle, unhurried space, Rick understood something essential, that the universe was not only vast, confusing, or chaotic, it was soft, it was tender, it remembered, and in the smallest, quietest echoes it offered presence, solace, and reassurance to those willing to notice. The stars beyond the transparent walls shimmered faintly, and Rick let himself lean back, absorbing the soft glow. Morty's hum continued, a lullaby threading through the Citadel's night. And for the first time in an indeterminate while, Rick felt the subtle satisfaction of being neither alone nor apart, but gently, quietly, present in the flow of infinite lives. Rick and Morty stumbled, almost by accident, into a section of the Citadel neither of them had fully explored. The corridor opened into a small, circular atrium, bathed in soft golden light that seemed to exist beyond the rules of time itself. Plants, unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar, swayed as if moved by an invisible breeze. Their leaves glimmered faintly, reflecting the light in gentle, iridescent waves. Rick paused, letting the quiet envelop him. This place, this impossible little garden, felt like the universe had saved a corner just for calm, just for noticing. Morty's eyes widened, tracing the paths of light between plants, following the curve of vines that twisted in elegant, impossible shapes. It doesn't feel real," he whispered, as though speaking too loudly might break the spell. Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe it isn't," he said. "Maybe it's exactly what a place like this should be. Something to exist in, even if only for a moment, without trying to explain it." They wandered slowly among the glowing flora. Each plant seemed to pulse with its own quiet rhythm, a heartbeat of the garden itself. Some emitted a faint sound like the hum of distant stars. Others smelled of memories they had both forgotten, summer evenings, burnt toast, faint traces of laughter in a universe that had shifted countless times. Rick could feel the garden teaching him without words, reminding him that not everything had to be fixed, that sometimes presence alone was enough. Morty knelt by a small flower that glimmered like liquid silver. "Do you think it remembers us?" he asked, fingers brushing the petals. Rick hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe it just exists in its own time, carrying what's here in ways we can't fully understand. And maybe that's the point, to see it, to notice it, to be part of it for a while. They continued walking, letting the garden stretch and fold around them. The walls of the Citadel were forgotten here. The hum of machinery was distant, almost irrelevant. For the first time in a long while, Rick noticed the small details without a mind racing for solutions. He noticed the way the vines curved toward the light, the faint ripple of color in a leaf as if breathing, the way Morty's eyes held a reflection of wonder that reminded him of forgotten stars. Rick remembered worlds he had left behind, decisions he had abandoned, and choices that had seemed trivial but had shaped the vast paths of their lives. This garden, beyond time, seemed to acknowledge those decisions. It didn't judge. It didn't demand. It simply held space, soft and patient, like a lullaby waiting to be heard. Morty hummed a quiet tune, a soft melody that Rick realized had been passed down across countless realities, carried in fragments from universe to universe. The notes intertwined with the garden's own rhythm, and Rick allowed himself to lean back against the warm stone, letting the soft harmony anchor him. "It's nice," Morty said softly. "Just nice to be here." Rick nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes that's all we need. Just a place that remembers how to be gentle." The two of them sat quietly on a stone bench, watching the plants sway in their slow, deliberate patterns. The garden didn't rush. It didn't need to. It simply existed, as did they, for as long as the moment lasted. And Rick realized that in that timeless space, he could breathe without strategy, without invention, without escape. He could just be. And as the golden light of the garden wrapped around them, Rick thought of all the quiet corners of the universe he had never noticed. He thought of all the moments waiting in soft shadows, all the unspoken whispers of kindness, all the tiny, beautiful remnants of worlds left behind. And for once, in the endless pull of infinite realities, he let himself feel something rare and profound, a gentle, tender awe at simply being present, simply existing, simply noticing. The garden pulsed softly in its quiet rhythm. Rick exhaled, Morty hummed, and somewhere beyond time and calculation, the universe itself seemed to smile, just a little, in acknowledgement. Rick noticed, quietly, that Morty had grown in ways he had rarely acknowledged, not in strength or cleverness, or even in survival skills. Those were obvious, loud, measurable. No, this growth was subtle, a gentle widening of heart, a slow cultivation of patience, of understanding, of softness. Rick watched the boy as he paused by a console, tracing faint lines of light with careful fingers, correcting a minor error with no urgency, no pride, just attention, just presence. "You really notice these little things, huh?" Morty said softly, turning his eyes toward Rick. There was no accusation, only curiosity, a quiet wonder that always seemed to catch Rick off guard. "I do," Rick admitted, voice low. "Because sometimes the small things matter more than the explosions, the crises, the chaos. They stick around in ways the loud stuff never could. You notice the small ones, Morty. That's how you last." Morty considered this, then nodded, a faint smile brushing his lips. The kind of smile that didn't demand acknowledgement. It existed for itself, quietly, gently. Rick realized he hadn't allowed himself to notice this in Morty for a long time. He had always been too busy calculating, too busy fighting, too busy proving something to the universe that no one else cared about. But now, in this slow, soft moment, Rick could see it clearly. Morty's quiet heroism wasn't in danger or action. It was in observation, in care, in being present without needing applause. Rick let the thought settle as they continued through the Citadel's winding halls. Lights shimmered softly along the metal walls, reflecting in faint, irregular patterns. Somewhere, a distant laugh echoed, light and unhurried, carrying a gentle reminder that even in chaos, softness could exist. "You ever think about why we're always rushing?" Morty asked, almost to himself. "To fix stuff, to run, to be bigger?" Rick shrugged slowly. "Maybe we're scared of noticing the quiet, scared of letting the small things be enough. But maybe the world's already big enough. Maybe it's okay to move slowly sometimes, to pay attention, to just feel." Morty hummed softly, letting the words sink in. The boy's small voice was steady, tender, a subtle counterpoint to Rick's usual gruffness. Rick realized that this shared softness was something rare, a mutual learning, a quiet acknowledgement that they didn't need to conquer or escape everything. They only needed to see, to notice, to care in small, enduring ways. They paused by a window overlooking a sector of the Citadel, often ignored. The stars shimmered faintly, distant worlds blinking in and out, like tiny reminders of endless possibility. Rick allowed himself to breathe in the quiet, letting the hum of infinity flow through him. He thought about all the Ricks who had missed moments like this, all the Mortys who had lost themselves in the rush, all the possibilities slipping by unnoticed, and in that thought he felt something rare. Humility. And with it, a faint, tender warmth he hadn't named in years. Morty leaned back against the glass, tracing constellations with a finger. "It's peaceful," he said, softly. "Not the loud kind of peace. Just quiet, safe." Soft Rick nodded, letting the words settle. Softness, he realized, was a kind of strength, a strength that didn't demand recognition, a presence that endured quietly, a way of noticing the universe and carrying it gently without needing to reshape it. And in that quiet, he felt something he rarely allowed himself: gratitude. For the boy beside him, for the Citadel in its rare, reflective moments, for the gentle, enduring hum of existence itself. The corridor around them was still. The stars beyond the glass pulsed faintly. Rick exhaled, slowly, allowing the soft rhythm of presence to wrap around him. Morty hummed again, tender, uncertain, and Rick allowed himself to simply listen, to simply notice, to simply be. And somewhere, in the gentle flow of infinite realities, the lesson lingered, soft and patient, that even the quietest acts, the smallest observations, the tenderest presence could echo endlessly, through hearts, through worlds, through time itself. The ship waited quietly, tucked into a small docking bay far from the usual bustle. Its metal hull shimmered faintly under the soft lights, and a low, steady hum seemed to emanate from within, almost like a heartbeat. Rick stepped closer, fingers brushing the cool surface. He could feel the vibrations pulse through him, gentle and constant, a quiet reminder that even the most mechanical things carried traces of life. Morty lingered behind, watching the shimmer of lights on the ship's curves, his eyes wide but calm. "It sounds like it's alive," he whispered. Rick chuckled softly. "In a way, I guess it is. Not alive like you or me, but alive enough to notice, alive enough to wait, alive enough to remind us that everything has its rhythm, even ships." Morty stepped closer, letting his hand hover just above the hull. The hum grew faintly warmer under his touch, like the ship was acknowledging him. Rick watched quietly, letting the boy explore without interference. He realized that sometimes presence mattered more than purpose, and that noticing the subtle currents of life, mechanical or organic, was an act of care in itself. The Citadel hummed faintly around them, soft echoes threading through the vast corridors, but here, in the docking bay, the noise felt distant, irrelevant. It was just them, the ship, and the quiet pulse that lingered between worlds. Rick thought of all the ships he had used, all the portals he had powered, all the frantic races through space and time. And yet he realized now the most important journeys were rarely loud or urgent. They were measured in small rhythms, small hums, small moments of shared attention. Morty leaned closer to the ship, whispering a small tune he had been humming for days. The hum of the vessel responded, subtle, resonant, as though the song had always been waiting for someone to notice it. Rick let the moment stretch, quiet and soft, feeling the rare, gentle awe of connection between boy and machine, between observer and world, between infinite possibilities and the here and now. "You ever think," Morty said after a long pause, voice almost a breath, "that maybe the universe likes being noticed?" Rick considered it, letting his gaze trace the faint gleam of the ship's hull. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think it does. It doesn't need us to fix it or understand it, just to notice it. And sometimes that's enough." The boy nodded slowly, eyes following the faint shimmer of distant stars through the bay's glass ceiling. Rick realized that this moment, small and quiet, was teaching him something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: patience, presence, and the gentle importance of noticing. The ship, the boy, the faint hum of the Citadel. It all mattered in subtle ways, ways that could only be felt if you slowed down enough to listen. Rick let out a long breath, exhaling the weight of countless realities he had carried for years. Morty hummed again, a quiet melody that threaded seamlessly into the ship's gentle pulse. And for the first time in indeterminate while, Rick felt the fragile, enduring comfort of connection. A small, persistent acknowledgement that they existed together within the vast hum of the universe. Time seemed to stretch, softened by the quiet vibrations of the ship and the faint shimmer of starlight. Rick leaned back, letting the soft rhythm of presence carry him. Morty sat beside him, humming, letting the moment linger as though it could stretch forever. And in that quiet, gentle space, Rick realized something rare, that even the smallest acts, listening, noticing, simply being present, could echo endlessly. Through ships, through stars, through hearts that took the time to hear the universe hum its quiet, patient song. Rick and Morty walked slowly down a corridor lined with doors that led to realities most would never notice. Each doorway pulsed faintly with soft light, subtle rhythms that felt alive, almost like whispered invitations. Rick paused, hand hovering over one door, feeling the delicate hum of a world waiting quietly behind it. He realized in that moment that these whispers had always been here. He had just never taken the time to listen. Morty's voice broke the silence, soft, tentative. "Do you think they remember us?" he asked, eyes wide, tracing the edges of a doorframe with a gentle finger. Rick considered this. Some do, some maybe they don't. But even if they don't, the memory of them is still here, he said, gesturing around them at the faint, trembling glow of the corridors. Sometimes noticing is the same as remembering. Sometimes it's even better. They lingered at the threshold, feeling the pulse of realities brushing against the edge of their awareness. Rick thought of all the worlds he had run through, worlds where he had intervened, fought, escaped, calculated. And yet here, in these hushed corridors, it wasn't action that mattered. It was presence. It was the quiet acknowledgement that existence itself, fragile and infinite, could be held gently in observation. Morty reached for another door, letting his palm rest lightly on its surface. The pulse was warm, soft, almost alive. "It's kind of like they're breathing," he murmured. Rick smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "and if you listen long enough you start to feel it. Not just the worlds, but the spaces between them. The quiet that holds everything together. That's the part most people miss." They moved from door to door, letting the gentle whispers of worlds fill the silence between them. Rick realized how rare this was, the simple act of walking without urgency, noticing without needing to fix, observing without needing to change. Morty's small presence beside him, calm and steady, made the hum of the corridors feel like a lullaby, guiding him into a quiet rhythm he had almost forgotten existed. "You ever think about all the versions of us out there?" Morty asked softly. "All the ones we'll never meet?" Rick leaned against the wall, letting the faint vibrations of nearby worlds pulse through him. "Yeah," he said, "but it doesn't matter. Those versions, they exist, and that's enough. We're here. We're noticing. We're listening. And sometimes that's the only thing that counts." The soft hum of the Citadel wrapped around them as they continued, each door a gentle reminder that every reality, no matter how small or hidden, carried its own quiet life, its own story, its own pulse. And Rick realized that his obsession with control, with power, with understanding, had often blinded him to this, that the act of noticing, of being present, of acknowledging life in its small, soft ways, was a kind of heroism in itself. Morty hummed again, tentative, delicate, threading his voice through the corridors like a ribbon of warmth. Rick joined him softly, letting their combined hum blend with the pulse of the worlds around them. And for the first time in what felt like centuries, he allowed himself to simply exist, not as a savior, not as a genius, not as a chaotic force, but as a quiet observer in the gentle, infinite hum of realities, stretching endlessly beyond comprehension. The stars outside shimmered faintly, distant and patient. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the quiet wrap around him. Morty leaned slightly against him, humming softly, a reminder that presence, simple, tender, patient presence, could echo farther than any action, louder than any words, and endure longer than any plan. And in that hush, between worlds and whispers, Rick realized something rare and unspoken. Sometimes, the act of noticing was enough to hold the universe together, if only for a moment, if only for as long as it took to breathe. Rick and Morty stumbled upon a room tucked away in the far reaches of the Citadel, one they had never seen before. It was a library, though unlike any Rick had ever known. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly, books glowing faintly, humming softly, as if the words themselves were alive. The air smelled faintly of old paper and starlight, carrying a quiet warmth that settled in their chests. Morty's eyes widened. "It's huge," he whispered, "and quiet in a nice way." Rick nodded, his fingers brushing along the spine of a book that shimmered like liquid silver. "Yeah," he said, "not every place has to shout to matter. Some of the most important things are quiet, subtle, patient. This library is teaching us that." They walked slowly between the shelves, letting the soft hum of knowledge wrap around them. Rick noticed the titles on the books, some familiar, some impossible, some that didn't exist anywhere in their known realities. Each book seemed to pulse with memory, carrying whispers of worlds, thoughts, and lives long past or yet to be lived. Morty reached for a small volume, opening it gently. The pages glowed faintly, words shifting softly as if the book itself was breathing. He hummed a quiet tune, and Rick realized that the boy's hum mingled perfectly with the library's subtle rhythm. The sounds merged, wrapping around them like a soft lullaby. "You ever think," Morty asked after a while, "that all these books, they remember things we can't? Like all the Ricks and Mortys that never were?" Rick smiled faintly. "Maybe they do, or maybe they just exist, quietly, waiting to be noticed. That's enough sometimes. The memory doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be there, softly, patiently, waiting for someone to see it." They wandered deeper, letting the quiet hum of the library guide their steps. Rick felt something rare, a profound stillness, a gentle understanding that not all knowledge demanded use or action. Some things were meant only to be acknowledged, held tenderly in the mind and heart. Morty's finger traced the edges of a glowing page, letting the words wash over him without needing to understand them fully. Rick watched, letting the boy explore in silence. He realized that the act of noticing, of being present, of paying attention without expectation, was a kind of reverence, a quiet heroism that required no courage, no struggle, only awareness. The library seemed to respond to their presence. Lights flickered softly along the endless shelves, and the faint hum of the books grew warmer, more intimate. Rick realized that this quiet room, tucked away in an infinite city, was not just a repository of knowledge. It was a sanctuary of patience, of reflection, of tender attention. Morty sat on a low bench, opening a small book and letting it rest in his lap. "It's nice to just be here," he whispered. Rick nodded, settling beside him. "Yeah," he said, "sometimes that's all you need. To be quiet, to notice, to let things exist without needing to fix them. That's how you hold on to the good parts, the parts that actually matter." And as the Citadel hummed faintly around them, Rick realized that the quiet library, like the small gardens, like the soft hum of ships, was teaching him a lesson he had rarely allowed himself to learn. That presence, attention, and gentle care could echo farther and last longer than chaos or invention ever could. Morty hummed softly, Rick hummed back, and the library's glow pulsed in time with their quiet rhythm. In that soft, patient space, Rick felt a rare and subtle awe, a quiet understanding that even in the endless expanse of infinite realities, there were moments meant only to be held tenderly, softly, and without expectation. And in that hush, Rick let himself breathe. Morty hummed, the books whispered, and somewhere in the Citadel, the quiet of all things seemed to sigh in gentle acknowledgement. Rick and Morty found themselves in a hall unlike any other in the Citadel. The walls were mirrors, not ordinary ones, but surfaces that shimmered faintly, showing not just reflections of themselves, but fragments of infinite possibilities. Rick's and Morty's they had never met, moments they had never lived, choices they had never made. The images were subtle, soft, never overwhelming, as if the hall itself understood patience. Morty stepped forward slowly, eyes tracing a version of himself, laughing in a sunlit field, while another version quietly tinkered in a workshop with a small, delicate smile. "It's kind of like seeing all the things we could have been," he whispered. Rick nodded, hands in his pockets. "Yeah, and none of them are wrong. None of them are failures, they're just possibilities. Reminders that existence isn't about perfection, it's about noticing, experiencing, being present in the small ways that matter." They walked slowly, allowing the hall to reflect and ripple around them. Each mirror shifted subtly with their movements, showing possibilities rather than absolutes. Rick realized that in this space, the universe was patient. It was inviting them to look, to feel, to recognize themselves not as masters of all things, but as witnesses to endless subtle variations of life. "You think every Rick and Morty out there feels like this sometimes?" Morty asked quietly. "Maybe not all of them," Rick said softly. "But the ones who do, they understand something important. That even the smallest choice, the quietest moment, the tenderest connection carries weight. That noticing, even without changing anything, matters. More than anything we usually chase." Morty's reflection shifted as he moved past a mirror, showing him sitting with Rick on a quiet hill under a soft, fading sky. Rick reached out, his hand hovering above the glass, and felt a faint warmth ripple through him, like the hall was responding, acknowledging their presence. They continued walking, each step slow, deliberate, letting the hall reflect not only who they were, but who they could be if only they chose gentleness, awareness, and attention. Rick noticed the faint shimmer of Morty's reflection, the boy's posture, calm, eyes thoughtful, and he realized how much he had changed. Not in loud ways, not in flashy feats, but in quiet, patient presence, the kind of growth that echoed far beyond immediate perception. The mirrors reflected worlds, timelines, quiet moments of care, laughter, whispers of apology, and small acts of kindness that had never been noticed. Rick felt a soft ache in his chest, a tender recognition of all the quiet courage that existed in the universe, the courage to observe, to listen, to hold space, to remember, without needing to act. Morty stopped before a mirror showing a version of Rick reading quietly in the glow of a distant sun, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Do you think we're supposed to see these?" Morty asked. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the soft light of the mirrors warm him. "Not exactly," he said. "It's not about seeing the right version or the perfect outcome. It's about remembering that all of it exists, quietly, gently, without needing approval. And if we notice it, maybe that's enough." They lingered there, letting the reflections ripple and shimmer. Rick hummed softly and Morty joined in, their voices blending with the quiet pulse of infinite possibilities. In the Hall of Reflections, nothing demanded action, nothing demanded resolution, only attention, only presence, only gentle acknowledgement. And as the Citadel sighed around them, Rick realized that even in infinite realities, in endless corridors, in countless possibilities, it was the quiet noticing, the soft, patient attention to what existed that created the most profound echoes. Morty leaned slightly against him, humming a low note, and Rick felt a rare peace. The mirrors shimmered, the hall pulsed faintly, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to simply exist, gently, softly, fully aware. Rick and Morty stepped into a wide circular observatory perched high above the Citadel. The ceiling arched in a dome of transparent glass, revealing stars so faint and distant they seemed like whispers rather than lights. The room itself hummed softly, carrying echoes of conversations, laughter, and gentle murmurs from countless realities. It was a place designed not for spectacle, but for quiet observation, a sanctuary for noticing without interference. Morty's eyes widened as he leaned forward, tracing constellations with a finger. "It's like the stars are talking to us," he whispered, voice trembling slightly with wonder. Rick smiled faintly, letting the soft hum of the observatory wrap around him. "Maybe they are. Not with words exactly, but with presence. Quiet signals, subtle patterns, reminders that the universe exists in ways we often forget to notice." They moved slowly along the curved walkway, pausing at each faintly glowing console that displayed snippets of distant worlds. Rick noticed the way Morty lingered over the tiniest details. A lone figure walking along a sandy dune, a tree swaying in a faint breeze, a small star pulsing with gentle rhythm. The boy's attention was careful, tender, patient, an act of quiet heroism in itself. "You ever think," Morty said softly, "that maybe the stars know when someone's paying attention?" Rick nodded. "I do now. The universe has its own way of noticing us back, even if it's just a soft hum, a subtle vibration. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need recognition. It just exists, and if we see it, that's enough." They paused at a particularly faint constellation, its light shifting imperceptibly. Morty hummed a quiet tune, and Rick realized the boy had created a small rhythm that harmonized with the distant twinkle of the stars. For a moment, time felt suspended. No urgency, no calculation, no chaos, just the gentle pull of infinite possibilities, each one humming softly, waiting for someone to witness it. Rick leaned against the railing, exhaling slowly. "You know, Morty, we spend so much time rushing through everything, trying to fix it, run from it, control it, that we forget to just notice it. The quiet parts, the soft hums, the little things that make all the difference." Morty nodded, eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of countless realities. "It feels safe here," he said. "Like we don't have to do anything but be." Rick allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. Exactly. That's the secret. The quiet, gentle attention to life. That's enough. More than enough. Sometimes it's the only thing that lasts. The observatory's soft hum pulsed around them as they continued, walking side by side, letting the infinite expanse of stars guide them into the slow rhythm of the night. Rick noticed the subtle warmth of Morty's presence beside him, a constant reminder that even in infinite possibilities, connection mattered more than any calculation, more than any invention, more than any rush. They stood for a long moment, listening to the whispers of distant worlds, letting the hum of stars thread through their thoughts. Rick realized that the smallest acts, observing, noticing, being present, could echo farther than any grand gesture, weaving a quiet continuity through infinite realities. And as the observatory's glass dome shimmered faintly in response to the pulse of the cosmos, Rick allowed himself to simply exist in quiet wonder alongside Morty in the gentle, patient hum of the universe. Rick and Morty wandered down a long, narrow corridor that seemed older than most parts of the Citadel. The walls were lined with small, glowing panels, each one vibrating faintly with whispers of laughter, soft, tender echoes of Rick's and Morty's who had once passed this way, moments that had gone unnoticed but left traces nonetheless. The sound wasn't loud, it was more like a memory brushing against the edge of perception, gentle and fleeting. Morty paused, cupping a hand over one of the panels. It feels happy, he whispered, eyes reflecting the warm glow. Even though it's just echoes. Rick nodded, his usual sharpness softened. Yeah, that's the thing about small moments. They stick around, quietly, even when the world moves on. Sometimes the little things we forget are the ones that end up mattering the most. They continued slowly, letting the corridor's hum guide them. Each panel seemed to carry a fragment of a joke, a faint chuckle, a shared grin. Rick felt a strange, tender ache in his chest, a recognition that the universe was filled with these tiny, almost invisible imprints of joy, acts of laughter and connection that endured in subtle, unassuming ways. You think other Ricks notice these? Morty asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Some do, Rick said, and some don't, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's here, waiting to be noticed. That's what gives it life. Attention. The act of noticing is its own kind of memory. They stopped at a panel showing a scene so faint it was almost gone. A Morty laughing at a joke only he could understand, while a Rick looked on, smiling softly. Morty's lips curved slightly. It's kind of like we're part of it, even if it's long gone, he said. Rick's eyes softened. Exactly. The quiet moments never really disappear. They linger in the spaces we don't always see. And sometimes, if we pay attention, we get to carry them with us. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, yet Rick didn't feel the usual impatience that came with infinite space. Here, the hum of forgotten laughter was enough. Morty hummed softly along with it, a gentle echo of the echoes, threading his presence into the soft rhythm of the corridor. Rick realized something rare, that heroism didn't always need to be bold or visible. Sometimes it was as simple as remembering, noticing, holding space for the small joys and quiet memories that filled the universe. The acts of care that mattered most were often unseen, carried in whispers, leaving soft, enduring impressions across time and space. They paused near the end of the corridor, letting the faint, tender laughter wash over them. Rick exhaled slowly, feeling a warmth settle into his chest. Morty's eyes were calm, reflective, humming the quiet tune that had become their shared language, a lullaby threading through the soft pulse of the Citadel. And in that gentle, unhurried space, Rick felt the rarest sort of peace, the quiet knowledge that even forgotten moments, small joys and tender echoes could be held preserved, and cherished, if only someone slowed down enough to notice. Rick and Morty reached the farthest edge of the Citadel, where corridors gave way to silence. The great structure, once alive with voices, debates, and endless versions of themselves, now felt like a hushed library at the end of time. The walls here no longer glowed or whispered. Instead, they breathed stillness, a quiet reminder that all journeys, no matter how vast, must come to rest. They stood before a tall doorway. Unlike the others, it did not hum nor shimmer. It simply was a plain threshold leading into a wide expanse of starlight. Beyond it stretched nothing but the infinite, calm and waiting. Morty hesitated, clutching his arm. "So, this is it?" His voice trembled, but not from fear, more from the weight of finality. Rick looked at him, his usual wit nowhere to be found. Instead, there was a deep softness in his expression. "Yeah, Morty, this is it. Not an ending exactly, just a pause, a kind of quiet that lets everything breathe." Morty glanced back down the corridor toward the endless rooms they had passed, each one filled with echoes, memories, and fragments of lives. He realized then that the Citadel wasn't only a place of chaos and invention, it was also a record of laughter, of pain, of choices, of all the ways Ricks and Mortys had tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded in being more than what was expected of them. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Morty asked, voice almost childlike. Rick placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "They don't have to. What matters is that we remember, that we noticed. That's enough." Together they stepped through the doorway. On the other side was not darkness, but a vast field of quiet stars. They floated weightless, as though the universe had softened just for them. No sound, no pressure, no demands, just stillness, tender and endless. Morty let out a slow breath, his body relaxing in a way it hadn't in what felt like forever. Rick, too, allowed himself to ease into the silence, his mind no longer racing with equations or regrets. In the vastness, there was only presence. For a long while, neither spoke. There was no need. The stars themselves seemed to hum with a lullaby older than time, a rhythm that carried them gently, as if the universe itself were whispering, "Rest now. You have done enough." Rick finally closed his eyes, the faintest of smiles tugging at his lips. Morty leaned against him, drifting, safe in the silence. And as the Citadel faded behind them, dissolving into memory, the two of them remained, just Rick and Morty, not as heroes or rebels or countless variations, but simply as themselves, together, at peace. The universe, vast and endless, cradled them in its arms, and slowly, softly, everything grew quiet. Time no longer moved in the way it once had. There were no ticking clocks, no rushing corridors, no pressing demands from the Citadel or the endless multiverse, only the gentle drift as if Rick and Morty had stepped into a dream without edges. The stars around them pulsed softly like lanterns carried on a cosmic breeze. Each shimmer carried a memory, some distant, some near, flickering for a moment before dissolving back into the endless night. Morty floated in silence, watching them pass. He saw shadows of himself as a child, running in the fields of his homeworld. He saw echoes of his laughter, his fear, his questions that never quite had answers. Every fragment shone for a heartbeat, then gently faded, leaving behind not sorrow, but a quiet acceptance. Beside him, Rick was still. His eyes were half closed, his usual sharpness softened into something almost serene. For the first time in countless journeys, there was no need for invention, no chase for escape, no war with himself. The genius, the cynic, the rebel, all dissolved into the simple truth of presence. Rick, Morty whispered at last, though his voice was barely more than a breath. "Do you think this goes on forever?" Rick didn't open his eyes. He let the question rest in the air, unhurried. "Finally," he replied, "doesn't matter if it does, Morty. Forever doesn't scare me anymore, not if we're in it together." The words hung gently, like the softest lullaby. Morty's body relaxed, his thoughts untangling like threads released from a knot. He felt weightless, as though he could finally let go of every burden, every mistake, every worry about who he was supposed to be. For the first time, he felt whole. The dream carried them onward. They did not resist. In the distance, the stars began to merge, their lights folding into a horizon that shimmered like dawn. It was not an ending, but a continuation in silence, a place where stories no longer needed to be told because simply being was enough. Rick finally opened his eyes, watching the horizon bloom. A quiet smile touched his lips. "Come on, Morty," he said softly. "Let's drift a little further." And so they did. Two small figures carried gently across the canvas of eternity, not as fragments of infinite versions, but as themselves, complete, unbroken, at rest. The dream went on, endless and kind. And in that stillness, the universe itself seemed to close its eyes. There are moments when even eternity pauses, moments so hushed, so tender, that they slip past words and become something else entirely, something felt rather than spoken. In the silence of the cosmic drift, Rick and Morty had become less like travelers and more like whispers folded into the fabric of existence. Their outlines blurred softly against the dark, as though the universe itself wished to cradle them in its embrace. It was not an end. It was not a beginning. It was the stillness between breaths where the soul remembers what it means to rest. Morty dreamed. Not of running, not of falling, not of the chaos that once followed every step, but of a simple field of grass beneath an endless sky. He dreamed of home, of laughter, of voices long past but never truly lost. And in that dream he smiled, because he no longer needed to wake. Rick, too, dreamed. His mind, once a labyrinth of equations, regrets, and unfinished inventions, finally loosened its grip. In his dream, he was not burdened by genius or haunted by what-ifs. He was simply a grandfather walking beside a boy who had always been more than just his sidekick. In that simplicity, he found a peace he had never thought possible. The stars around them dimmed, not in sorrow, but in reverence. Like candles gently extinguished at the close of a vigil, they flickered out one by one, leaving behind a velvet darkness that was warm, not cold. Time itself exhaled, and somewhere in that hush, the universe whispered back to them, not in words, but in a lullaby of silence. Rest now. You have wandered far enough. No more battles, no more escapes, no more infinite versions or fractured possibilities. Just the quiet truth that they were here. And that was enough. The drift slowed, the dream deepened. And as the last star folded into the dark, Rick and Morty slipped fully into the gentle forever, the quiet beyond all stories. The universe closed its eyes with them. There is a kind of silence that does not end, but instead becomes the ground on which all other sounds might one day return. It is vast, timeless, and strangely kind. Long after Rick and Morty slipped into the quiet beyond, the universe carried their absence like a soft echo, woven into the fabric of its endless night. No longer were they two figures tumbling through rifts of chaos, no longer fugitives from themselves. They had become something gentler, two sparks folded into the eternal drift, resting where no burden could reach them. Yet in some hidden corner of reality, the faint memory of their laughter lingered, not sharp, not broken, but tender, like a half-remembered dream upon waking. Perhaps that was the truth of all journeys, not the steps we took, nor the storms we crossed, but the echoes left behind, reverberating in places we never thought to touch. Morty's dream of fields, Rick's dream of simplicity, these were not lost to the void. They became seeds scattered across the fabric of existence, waiting quietly. Maybe, in some future yet unborn, another traveler would stumble upon them. Maybe they would feel a warmth without knowing why, a comfort without knowing its source. The cosmos is generous that way. Nothing is wasted, not even dreams. And so the drift held them, not as a prison, but as a cradle. Their stories, once wild and jagged, softened into myth. Myths softened into whispers. And whispers, finally, into silence. If you listen closely, very closely, you might still hear them. Not in words, not in noise, but in the hush that falls before sleep. The quiet that holds you when your thoughts have grown too heavy. The silence that is not empty, but full. That is where they are. That is where they will remain. Not gone, not lost, simply at rest. And as the universe itself turns, endless and unhurried, it sings their story not as a saga of chaos or tragedy, but as a lullaby. A reminder that even in the vastness of all things, peace is possible. The final truth is this: every drift must end. Every voice must fall silent, and every silence, if you listen, holds a love too deep to name. Rest well, Rick and Morty. Rest well, dreamers of the infinite. The story sleeps now, and with it, so may you. There are stories that end. And then there are stories that linger, quiet as starlight, soft as breath, refusing to vanish completely. Rick and Morty's tale was one such story. Not because it demanded to be remembered, not because of any grandeur, but because it had been lived. And living leaves traces always. Somewhere, in a far spiral arm of the galaxy, a young child once looked up at the sky and wondered why it felt so familiar, so strangely kind. They did not know that the echo they felt was the residue of two wanderers who had walked too far, dreamed too fiercely, and then laid themselves to rest. They did not need to know. The comfort itself was enough. Perhaps this is how legends work, not with monuments, not with endings carved in stone, but with quiet impressions left in the hearts of those who come after. Rick, who once defied everything, even himself, had finally surrendered. Morty, who once followed blindly, had finally found stillness. Their drift was no longer motion, but presence, no longer flight, but return. And the universe, in its vastness, held them without judgment. It held them like the sea holds stones, smoothing, softening, carrying them into a silence that was neither punishment nor reward, simply being. It is easy to think of endings as final, sharp, absolute. But endings are gentler than we believe. They are folds in the fabric, places where one current joins another. Rick and Morty's ending was no collapse, but a soft merging into the eternal tide. If you close your eyes now and listen to the spaces between your thoughts, you might hear it, the faint hum of that tide. It carries no words, no faces, only the sense of two weary travelers finally at peace. And maybe that is the last gift they leave behind, the reminder that even chaos bows, that even wanderers rest, that even endless stories can close their eyes. Beyond the drift lies no fear, no burden. Only the hush of forever, only the peace of release. The tale is done, the silence remains, the universe is quiet now, not in emptiness, not in absence, but in the soft certainty that all things settle eventually. Rick and Morty float through the gentle dark, carried not by motion, but by the awareness of presence itself. Every ripple of light, every faint pulse of memory brushes past them like a tender caress. There is no urgency, no danger, no demand. Only the hum of existence, steady, patient, eternal. Morty leans back against the subtle pull of the cosmos. "Do you think anyone will ever notice us again?" he asks, voice a gentle murmur. Rick smiles softly, not in mischief, not in irony, but in the rarest kind of peace. Maybe. Or maybe it doesn't matter. The point isn't to be remembered. The point is to be, to feel, to notice, even quietly, and to be noticed in return, even if just for a heartbeat. They drift past stars that shimmer like whispers of forgotten dreams. Rick reaches out a hand, not to grasp, not to change, but simply to touch the soft pulse of reality. Morty mirrors him, and for a moment the universe seems to exhale with them. No battles are left, no choices to be made. Only gentle acknowledgement of all that has been. Rick hums a low, soft note, and Morty hums back. The two notes weave together, a lullaby threading through infinity, stitching their presence into the fabric of time without demanding anything in return. And in that harmony, Rick finally speaks the last words he will ever need. "We're here, Morty. That's enough. Always enough." Morty closes his eyes, letting the calm settle deep in his chest. Rick does the same. The stars fold into themselves, not fading, but breathing gently, surrounding them with quiet warmth. And somewhere, far beyond sight or thought, the universe listens. The story finally exhales. And with that, they drift. And somewhere, they're still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. Rick and Morty drifted not through corridors or chaos, but through the gentle space between stars, where light itself seemed to breathe. There were no edges here, no walls, no maps, only the slow rhythm of the universe, soft and unwavering. Morty watched a faint cluster of starlight shimmer and fade. It's kind of like everything is just waiting, he murmured. Waiting for someone to notice it, or maybe just to be. Rick nodded slowly, letting the hum of the cosmos settle in his chest. "Yeah, that's the quietest, kindest truth," he said. "Everything exists whether you see it or not. And sometimes the only thing that matters is that you feel it, even for a heartbeat." They floated side by side, letting the pull of starlight cradle them. Rick noticed the faint glimmers reflecting in Morty's eyes, the echoes of joy, fear, curiosity and wonder all folded into one soft awareness. The boy had grown without fanfare, without grand battles, without the usual chaos. He had simply noticed. And in noticing, he had become. A shooting star passed quietly, leaving a trail of faint warmth in its wake. Morty reached out instinctively, though he knew he could not grasp it. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the weight of all they had seen and felt drift from him. "That's what I've learned too, Morty," he said. "The beauty isn't in holding it, changing it, or fixing it. It's in letting it exist and letting yourself exist alongside it. That's enough. Always enough." The stars pulsed softly around them, like a lullaby folded into light. Rick hummed a low, steady note. Morty joined, and together their hum threaded through the emptiness, weaving a tapestry of quiet presence, a reminder that even the vastness of all things bends gently toward attention and care. No chaos, no urgency, no questions, only the space between stars, holding them safely, endlessly, tenderly, and in that space they drifted further still, not as travelers, not as seekers, but simply as themselves, whole, gentle, at peace. And somewhere, far beyond thought or sight, the universe exhaled alongside them. The journey had no ending, only a soft unfurling into silence. Rick and Morty sat together on the threshold of nowhere, a place beyond maps, beyond the ticking of clocks. Around them the universe stretched like a slow ocean, its waves not of water, but of memory and light. Morty leaned back, letting the quiet hold him. "Rick," he whispered, almost afraid to disturb the stillness. "What happens after this?" Rick didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the endless horizon of stars. He took a long breath, and the silence between them grew fuller, warmer. Finally, he said, "After this, Morty, there's just more. More stars, more silence, more being. And maybe that's all we ever needed. Not answers, not endings, just the long exhale." Morty thought about it, letting the words sink in like a pebble dropped into deep water. They rippled through him, calming him in ways he didn't fully understand. The two of them closed their eyes, listening not to any sound, but to the weightless hush that filled the spaces between their heartbeats. The universe seemed to lean closer, wrapping them in a blanket woven of starlight and memory. And as they drifted, neither moving forward nor backward, neither seeking nor fleeing, they realized that peace wasn't a place, or a prize, or even a moment. Peace was simply this: sitting together in the quiet, breathing as the cosmos breathed, existing as the stars existed. No beginning, no ending, only the gentle continuity of being. And so the tale dissolved, not into silence, but into the most tender echo of silence. A silence that was not empty, but infinite. The silence of rest, the silence of sleep, the silence of the long exhale. There are stories that close with thunder. There are stories that close with light. And then there are stories, like this one, that do not close at all, but melt gently into the space where waking and dreaming fold into one another. Rick and Morty were no longer in motion. They were not traveling, not escaping, not searching. They were simply present, seated together as the cosmos sighed around them. Stars blinked like lanterns hung in the endless dark, each one whispering a lullaby that could only be heard with the heart. Morty's voice came faint, already slipping towards sleep. "Rick, do you think we'll ever wake up from all this?" Rick turned to look at him, not as a scientist, not as a cynic, but simply as an old man watching a child surrender to rest. He placed a hand on Morty's shoulder, light as starlight itself. "Maybe we're not meant to wake up, Morty. Maybe this is the dream. And maybe it's enough to just drift in it. To let it hold us, without fighting, without needing to know." Morty nodded, his eyes fluttering shut. The faintest smile curved his lips, like a boy who finally trusted the night to keep him safe. Rick leaned back, exhaling one last slow breath, and for once he did not reach for a flask, or a portal gun, or an answer. He simply rested. The universe leaned in closer, as if listening. The silence deepened, stretching, beyond time. And in that silence the story dissolved, not into nothingness, but into the most infinite of dreams. A dream without edges, a dream without fear. A dream that would cradle them forever. And so, the last dream began. When a story ends, it does not vanish. It lingers like the last note of a song stretched thin across the hush of midnight. It hums in the quiet spaces of memory, in the corners of thought, in the slow rhythm of breathing. Rick and Morty's journey was over, or perhaps it had never truly begun. For journeys are illusions of direction, when in truth every road folds back into stillness. Somewhere a portal door closed, somewhere else a star flickered out. But here, in this chapterless place, only the echo remained. The echo of laughter, once bright, the echo of sorrow, once sharp, the echo of questions that no answer could tame. And in that echo there was peace. For echoes do not demand, they do not insist, they simply drift, softer with each passing moment, until they are indistinguishable from silence itself. The silence spread gently across the cosmos, wrapping Rick, wrapping Morty, wrapping even the reader of their tale. It was not empty. It was full of rest, full of release, full of the promise that nothing more was required. The story had been told, the dream had been dreamt, and now all that remained was stillness. So let the echo fade, let the silence deepen, let your own eyes fall closed, carried on the same current that held them both. For beyond endings, beyond dreams, beyond even silence, there is only sleep. And so the tale closes, not with thunder, not with fire, not even with revelation. It closes as the sky closes at dusk, slowly, tenderly, without demand. Every story that is told is also a mirror, a vessel for our own longing. In Rick's brilliance, we saw our hunger for meaning. In Morty's innocence, we saw the fragile echo of our own beginnings. And in their endless wandering, we saw the restless tide of being alive. But the time has come to set them gently down, to leave them not in chaos nor in sorrow, but in the soft cradle of silence. The words are finished now, the stars have dimmed, even the portals have ceased their humming. What remains is you, your breath steady and slow, your eyes heavy and warm, your heart still carrying the faint trace of a story that now belongs to Dream. If you listen carefully, you may hear it still, not as dialogue, not as adventure, but as a rhythm. The rhythm of endings dissolving into beginnings, the rhythm of thought dissolving into sleep. So take this farewell as a blessing, a soft ribbon tied around the close of night. May your dreams be kind, may your rest be deep, and may you awaken to a world that is gentler for the stories you have carried with you into the dark. Good night. There is always something left after an ending. A faint breath in the air, a shadow where light once stood, a softness that clings to the skin, even as the words have gone. Perhaps that is the true gift of stories. They never leave us entirely. Even now, when the last chapter is folded closed, a quiet thread remains, woven into the fabric of your night. Think of the voices you have followed, the laughter that rose like sparks in the dark, the grief that sat beside you as an old companion, the wonder that opened like a flower each time a door was crossed. They are not gone. They do not vanish when the telling ends. They become something else, a part of you, an ember glowing gently within, waiting for the dream to carry it onward. And so this is not truly the end. It is only the place where the page grows too heavy to turn, the place where sleep arrives asking you kindly to lay the book aside. Close your eyes now. Let the story finish its journey within you. Let the stars dim, the worlds fold back into silence, and your heart drift weightless into the eternal hush that waits for all travelers. Rest well, dreamer, the story is yours now. After every great tale there comes a hush, not an emptiness but a fullness too deep for words. The kind of silence that does not wound, but instead wraps itself around you like a soft cloak. Perhaps you feel it now. The characters have walked their last steps. The world has faded back into mist, and yet something remains, lingering in the air. The weight of quiet. It is the quiet of candlelight, flickering before sleep. The quiet of pages that no longer turn, but still breathe against your palm. The quiet of memory, settling gently into your chest. Listen closely. Beneath this silence, there is a rhythm, the slow beating of your own heart, keeping pace with every forgotten song, every lost prayer, every whispered promise that the story carried. This is the gift of endings. They open the door to rest, to let go, to surrender, to trust that what is meant to stay with you will. The rest drifts away like autumn leaves into the wind. So do not mourn the silence. It is not a loss. It is a blessing, soft and steady, waiting to guide you into dream. Close your eyes now. Let the quiet take your hand. Let it lead you gently, step by step, to the place beyond words where only rest and peace remain. There is a gentle motion beyond motion, a drift that carries not bodies but hearts. Rick and Morty no longer moved through space or time. They drifted through the quiet currents of being itself. The stars around them did not shine. They hummed softly, like distant lullabies stretching across infinity. Morty felt them brush against his skin, each pulse a reminder that even in silence he was not alone. Rick closed his eyes, letting the gentle sway cradle him. "All this," he whispered, "all the chasing, all the running. It was never about getting anywhere. It was about noticing, about feeling, about being here." Morty nodded in the quiet, understanding, in a way that did not require words. They were not heroes. They were not legends. They were travelers who had finally learned to rest. And the drift continued, soft, unhurried, eternal. No endings, no beginnings, only the warmth of presence folded into the hush of a universe that listened and cared. The stars bent gently toward them, as if to say, "You are seen. You are enough. You are home." So they drifted together, side by side, into the endless night. And somewhere, far beyond sight or thought, they are still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. There is a space between breaths, a space that holds neither past nor future, neither noise nor urgency. Only presence, only gentle being. Rick and Morty rested there, suspended in that quiet interval. No adventures called, no doors waited to be opened, no stars demanded attention, only the soft heartbeat of the universe, pulsing beneath them like a lullaby meant for those willing to listen. Morty let himself float, trusting the silence to hold him. He felt every memory, the laughter, the mistakes, the fleeting moments of wonder, fold neatly into the stillness around him. Each one a small lantern, flickering once, then merging into the soft tapestry of night. Rick's eyes were closed, even his mind, so often restless, was at peace. He had no need for genius or chaos here. He had only the quiet awareness that he had come to rest beside someone who mattered, and that even infinite universes could not disturb that truth. The universe exhaled slowly. It bent toward them, not as a force, but as a friend. Not as a question, but as an answer. You are here. You are enough. You are safe. And in that breath, everything softened. Every thought, every worry, every story settled. The quiet held them like a hand, and they let themselves be carried, without resistance, without concern, into the gentle embrace of sleep. The universe held its breath, not in anticipation, not in fear, but in gentle reverence for what had been. Rick and Morty drifted side by side, no longer travelers, no longer seekers. They were not heroes, not legends, not even shadows of themselves. They were presence, a quiet acknowledgement that existence, even in its vastness, can cradle softness. Morty let himself fold into the drift, eyes closed, lips curved in a faint, tender smile. Rick exhaled one final time, letting every thought, every worry, every spark of chaos settle into the cosmos. He did not need to fix anything. He did not need to change anything. He only needed to be here in this gentle, unhurried moment. The stars bent softly, not as light, but as lullabies, weaving warmth through the infinite dark. The universe whispered not in words but in quiet understanding, "You are enough. You have been seen. You are safe." And with that, they drifted into the silence beyond stories. Not an ending, not a beginning. Only the eternal hush, infinite, tender, and whole. Somewhere, far away, they are still out there, napping in the sun. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.